Welcome, welcome. I'm Patricia McDonald. I'm the director of the Ulrich Museum of Art, and aren't we all glad that this is happening this evening and not last evening at exactly this time when we are all sort of quickly escorted off the campus. So cross your fingers, and here we go. At any rate, we've been working on a collection project at the Ulrich Museum for roughly the 2.5 years now. And I'll be honest, I have waited with very special interest and relish for this evening and this evening's program. Eugene Smith, as a photographer, counts among the very best, the most exceptional of photographers of the 20th century. And it's always humbling to be in a role where you are reintroducing an artist to his own hometown. Eugene Smith was born and grew up in Wichita. A precocious young man, was photographing for the city newspaper, really even as an early teenager, and then launched out into the world to then really become globally famous artist. Certainly over the years, I've learned of pivotal works and projects of this master, and yet I know that any knowledge that I have, any reading that I've done is just, it scratches the surface. But tonight we have the expert. He is the veritable walking, talking, breathing Eugene Smith machine, because he has devoted so many hours and so much time and so many years tracking the very special talent of this man. So Sam Stephenson is our speaker this evening. He teaches at Duke University, and he is also the director there of the Jazz Loft Project that is part of Duke's Center for Documentary Studies. Stephen has written 3 books to date on Eugene Smith: Dream Street, Eugene Smith's Pittsburgh Project, and that was with Faden Press; the Jazz Loft Project, Photographs and Tapes of Eugene Smith, and that was with Alfred Knopf; and Eugene Smith, another sort of everything you need to know about Eugene Smith kind of book for Faden Press. But he is presently, that doesn't stop him, it's only 3 books to date and going strong. He's presently working on a very encompassing biography on this artist, a book that he imagines is going to take him 2-3 or so years to research, write, and then with his publisher to produce. In between the different book projects, Stephenson's writing has appeared in the New York Times, Smithsonian Magazine, Paris Review, and Double Take. And that's just the short list. That's just to name the few. The Ulrich owns really, I think, an important cache of 22 exceptional photographs by Gene Smith. And a couple of the works that we own are iconic, globally well known. They are so famous. And given the important cache that we have in our collection, given that this is a native son, one of the programs we absolutely had to do in conjunction with Art of Our Time is invite Sam Stephenson to Wichita. If you would take the stage, thank you so much, and help me welcome him.
Thank you, Patricia. It is, excuse me, it's actually kind of moving for me to be here. I have been researching Smith for 13 years and 5 months, but this is the first time I've been to Wichita. I came in on Sunday, and it's really moving. I have spent this much time, but it never was intended. I mean, it just was an incremental thing. It grew. Appendages, and then the appendages grew appendages, and it became, I guess, life's work or something, or so-called career. But it just, I never knew. I mean, if you told me 13 years and 5 months ago that I'd be standing here in 2010 or whatever, still researching Eugene Smith, I would have said you are nuts. But it just happened, and it's gonna keep going. I've now got a really great publisher for a biography, and I've got material that nobody's had, and so I don't really have a choice. I have to do this, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about my saga over 13 years and how it meshes with Smith's saga, which was more tumultuous than mine, I'm happy to say. Ever since Amy contacted me, I don't know how long ago, and Patricia, the treatment that this organization has given me has been wonderful. It's really been first class, and I'm very thankful. Today, I also wanted to point out Jim Kaplinger, who's sitting on the back row. His father and Gene Smith's mother were brother and sister. So Jim is Gene's first cousin, lives in Topeka. Also, Mickey Armstrong, who's sitting right here on the aisle. Her late husband, who just sadly passed away less than a year ago, I believe, was one of Gene's best friends as kids. And Mickey just told a story as we were walking in the door about how Pete and Gene used to go out to the airport and photograph airplanes back in what would have been, I guess, the late 20s or early 30s. So this is real meaningful, very meaningful to be here, and I appreciate you coming. Let me get some water. This building, I'm going to talk for a while, and I'm going to be real informal. I'm actually going to get my watch out, so I'm really picky about not talking too long. So I do not want to do that, because I could talk for days about this. I've been researching this particular building right here for the last 10 years. That's where Smith lived from 1957 to 1971. He moved into the fourth floor of this building in 1957. And those 14 years after he left Wichita, that was the place that he spent the most time in his life, other than the Riverside neighborhood here. I went over to look at the house. He lived in two different houses over on the first, he was born in 1918 to 1926. He lived on, I'm spacing on the name of the road, but it's one block off of North River Boulevard. In 1926, his family moved to North River Boulevard. And one of the things, and I was over there walking around the other day, this building here is 6th Avenue. That's 6th Avenue right in front of the building, and that's 28th Street in New York City, in Manhattan. And so this is the west side of 6th Avenue, so this window looks east. And I was over there wandering around North River Boulevard the other day, looking at the house at 1233 North River Boulevard. And I realized that it was facing dead east. It's one of the only houses that faces due east there because of the way the road bends. But this one is situated in such a way that it looks straight towards the east. And this building did too. And it's a completely different environment, of course. He was sitting there, that house that he grew up in, the river runs right in front of it. And this is not a river, but it's a street running the same direction. I don't know if the river runs that direction, but whatever happens in front of the window goes the same way every single day. And I don't know if that's a coincidence or not, but Smith made 20,000 photographs out of that window. And I've just got to think, as I was standing over there at that house the other day, looking at that river, I've got to think something about that was similar. And I don't know, I've got to do some more thinking about that, and it might be that I decide that it's too far-fetched, but it just occurred to me. So I've been researching this building because he moved in there in 57, and he wired the building and made 1,740 reels of tape. He had this building wired from the sidewalk all the way up to the 5th floor. He had microphones going through ceilings, this has really been what's occupied me for the last 8 years of those tapes, because it took a lot of money to preserve them and then to listen to them for the first time. It ended up being over 4,000 hours of recordings. And this building was a legendary late night haunt of jazz musicians in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And so a lot of the tapes are of historic jazz sessions that took place in that building. But then there are a lot of tapes where he's talking about his father, his mother. He's talking with others, Diane Arbus, Cartier-Bresson, Salvador Dali, all kinds of people. And all of this is on tape, and I'll tell you more about that. I'm going to backtrack a little bit and go through a little bit. This is him in 1955. And this is very typical of him. He walked around. There are thousands of these little spiral notebooks in his archive at the University of Arizona. He really, as you know, he made his name, as you probably know, he made his name as a combat photographer in World War II. But his fascination with airplanes, as verified by Mickey Armstrong, goes back to his days as a kid here. And that makes perfect sense. And he photographed a lot of planes. He went up in planes. This is out in the Pacific where he was for 3 years, from 42 to 45, photographing the war. And I wanted to show you these two. This is the same negative. Part of my challenge over the years has been to figure out what motivated him and what he was one of the most passionate, one of the most feverish artists, not just photographers, but artists in American history. And what was, I don't know if you can ever explain anything, anybody who is as passionate as he was. But one of this photographer named David Vestal, who I interviewed about Smith, he told me that what Smith saw with his eyes was not capturable by a camera. In other words, what he saw with his eyes was not really there, and you know it was. So he was seeing with a passion, or he was seeing with a heart, he was seeing with a soul, he was seeing with something that was not visible, so I wanted to start out with these two. And he was very young. He would probably hate me if I showed you these from. He was in his early 20s when he did this, but he saw this. But this is what the camera recorded. And really, the rest of his life, I think, one of the reasons why he was so challenged emotionally, I mean, he never was able to reconcile that. He never was able, this is what was there, and this is what he saw. And his whole career is a process of trying to reconcile that, and he couldn't do it. Couple more. So another thing that I wanted to point out, and I think this may go back to his childhood. One of the things that he does is he's wonderful at making these intimate photographs like this. And then he makes these bigger like tableaus and like that. But he comes back to this. He comes back to the human being. And I'm wondering, so this is another pattern that sets up in his career. He photographs human beings very sympathetically, very compassionately. And then he in some ways he sort of indicts the larger culture. And he thinks the individual is sort of doomed up against this bigger, often mechanical human enterprise. And I think the war was, I'm losing my mind. I think the war was where his art really took form because he saw this combat up close. But look at this picture. This is in the, I think this is in the Philippines. And this was a letter that he wrote to his family. And you can see where he had folded it. But look at the joy on his face. I mean, we often, and I'm guilty of this, and I've got to be careful about this going forward. But if you look over the 13 years of my work on Smith, I think in the early days I overdid the sort of tormented artist. He was definitely tormented, but I just think I may have overdone it a little bit. It's kind of a romantic image that we all like. But look at that. Look at just the joy on his face. This is another example of the great tenderness that he was capable of and looked for. And caregiving is another theme in his career that pops up from this point when he's in his early 20s till he's in his 50s. Caregiving was a major part of his work. So then we have the big bomb blast. So this sort of cycle of these intimate moments and then the big bomb blast recurs throughout his, and then you can see the soldiers down here. They're they're tiny compared to this human-made mechanism. And by the way, if anybody has a comment or a question or anything, I'm happy. I'll take questions at the end, but feel free to raise your hand and at any point. So he almost was killed by a bomb in Okinawa in 1945, and then he was in rehab for a year, and this was, the legend has it, that this is the first photograph he made. This is the one in the show, and I'm going to talk about this again at the end of my talk. I'm going to read a little short piece that I wrote that involves this photo, so I'm going to hold off on that. He was into theater in a very, very passionate way. He often said that theater and music were his primary influences, not photography. And so Tennessee Williams here was one of his heroes. That is his wife, his first wife, Carmen. And to illustrate the degree to which he was influenced by theater, before the war, after he moved to New York, and he graduated from North High School in 1936, the same year that his father committed suicide, and the same spring, actually. And he went to Notre Dame for 1 year, 37, and then moved to New York to become a full-time photographer. So around 1939, and I have the exact date, but I can't remember it off the top of my head, he went to 28 consecutive performances of a musical. It was called Mexicana. It was a theater piece, and in the show there was a dancer named Marissa Flores, a flamenco dancer, who he fell in love with. He was assigned to shoot the show the first night for the reviews, but he was so enthralled he went back for 28 consecutive performances. And he started writing Marissa letters, and she was Spanish. She was Mexican. She did not speak English, and so somehow he met Carmen, who's Mexican American, and hired her, or I don't know if he paid her, but she was the interpreter. So he would write a letter, then she would write it in Spanish, and they'd mail it, and then Marissa would send the letters back, and she would write Marissa's letters in English so that Smith could read it. So he ended up not being able to marry Marissa, but he married Carmen. And so that's and their first daughter was named Marissa. So that tells you how much theater influenced him. It literally influenced him. I mean, it made a direct impact on his life. And so after the war, he became what he's now known as, I think. If you Google him, you'll probably see the words master of the photographic essay or father of the photographic essay. And that really took form after the war. And I'll show you a couple of examples of the most iconic photo essays that he did. Country Doctor in 1948, and this is in Colorado. And you can see the theatrical element in this. I mean, you could almost, some of these pictures, you could almost see them as being stage sets. So these stories, what he would do, is he would go live with this subject for weeks or months or ever how long it took him. He would photograph around the clock, and he would go back to New York and create these photo layouts, and this is in Life magazine. So what he was doing is he was going out into the world, usually someplace foreign to Life's readers. And Life magazine at its peak before television, or just after television, its peak circulation was 9.5 million copies a week. And that was in a country with less than half of the people we have now. The population is less than half, 9.5 million a week. And just to give you an example, I mean, like Time magazine is about 3 million now. Newsweek is about, I think it's about 2.5. So this was triple those numbers at a time when the population was less than half it is now. There will never be a commercial magazine with the power that these magazines had back before television. Nothing ever will come close. The only thing that I can think of that has the reach and the media that magazines did, that these magazines did, is probably 60 Minutes in its heyday. Probably there were the comparable numbers as a percentage of the overall population, because it wasn't just the single issues here. This magazine sat on coffee tables, it sat in waiting rooms at doctors' offices, it sat in libraries. I mean, it was more than 9.5 million people were seeing it. It was probably 20 or 30. It was probably, half the population were reading this every week. And Smith was one of their most famous photographers, and he was paid extremely well. They were a powerhouse economically. That whole Lutz. There's a new biography of Henry Lutz, by the way, that just came out, and it's fascinating. He's the one who started the Time Life empire. It's fascinating. So a couple more of these, and this is Spanish Village from 1951. And again, he's working in New York. He goes out into the world, someplace that most of Life readers have never been, and then he reports back with these stories. And he lives there as long as it takes for him, which is usually longer than the magazine expected. And he makes these amazing photographs, and then he comes back with, and then he creates these layouts. Now, before Smith, the photographer's over, the photojournalist's job was over when the negative was exposed. And in fact, Life, which was the powerhouse of photojournalism, they had a renowned lab for developing and making prints. I mean, most people would have been happy to have Life's lab make their prints and create these layouts. But Smith came along and said, no, you're not touching my negatives, you're not selecting which pictures to run, and you're not creating my layouts. And he said, if you editors in New York, if you in Midtown New York and Rockefeller Center or somewhere, if you had gone with me here and spent 3 months in Spanish Village every day, then maybe I'd let you edit these pictures. But if you weren't there with me, you have no idea what the story is, and so you're not doing that. So he was really a pioneer for artistic control of photography, and he developed a real legend in the field, and photographers revered him. But each one of these layouts was preceded by a very bitter struggle with Life's editors. But he was so good, he was revered by the professionals as well as the mainstream public. It was very hard to do. So people like Robert Frank loved him, Cartier-Bresson, Kappa. He was revered by all of them. And then the mainstream leader, that giant readership, also loved him. And so the relationship just sort of staggered forward, which with each published essay. This is Maud Callan in rural South Carolina, nurse midwife. Same thing, he lived with her. You have to get to know somebody really well to be able to get this kind of photograph. So he would stay there long enough to, and not in an insincere way, he would gain their trust. I mean, he was, I've traveled around the country, I've interviewed almost 400 people, and people loved him. I mean, he as he got older, his life got more and more rocky, more and more topsy-turvy. He became a drug addict and alcoholic, but people loved him. And he had an ability to go into places and be trusted that's really rare. Now, these spreads, he compared these spreads to music. Like I said, he said music and theater are my biggest influences, and he thought of these spreads in musical terms. The spread was more important than the individual picture. And when TV came around, TV changed the photo market, and also the photography for the first time became a part of the art market. And it really changed things. You can't sell that spread. This is Smith's art, these spreads, but you can't sell that. So, and then when TV came along, the magazines were like, oh gosh, we have this competitor that's going to squash us. You know, it's not unlike what the internet's doing today. TV did it 50 years ago. And so the magazines, these spreads would sometimes be 8 pages that Smith created. And they wanted eye-catching, titillating individual images instead of these meditative spreads, and especially with the advent of TV. So it just became almost impossible, a relationship. Also, his ambitions kept growing. He said that he peaked. He said late in his life that he peaked as a photographer in around 1958. And if you read his letters, I mean, you can just see this ambition growing. And he started using more and more film for these simple life magazines, these 8-page assignments where they would publish anywhere from 12 to 18 images. He would make 5,000 photographs and spend 3 months on these essays. And Life wanted somebody to accept the boundaries of the assignment and meet deadlines. And he started talking about his work in terms of Beethoven and Rembrandt and Thelonious Monk and Joyce and Goya, and if you can see that he starts talking about his work in these terms. And he finally quit life in late 1954. It was effective in January of '55, after this essay of Albert Schweitzer, when he went to what's now Gabon, Africa, and photographed Schweitzer's medical compound. And I was going to mention also, you saw the nurse midwife, country doctor, Schweitzer's medical compound. Healthcare was a really primary part of his career. And if you go, and he was a kind of a romantic guy, especially as he got more and more ambitious. And a lot of the romantics, the 19th century romantic poets, for example, they were all into healthcare too. There's something about caring for others and healing, and that I think is, and here's another example of that. These are leprosy patients being given their medicine. So this essay with Schweitzer, life, it's unclear exactly what happened, but anyway, the resulting layout in Life magazine, Smith hated, and his story was that they laid it out without asking him, that he didn't have final confirmation or final approval of the layout, and so he finally resigned. And he was making a lot of money. I think his salary was something like $35,000 a year at this time, 1954, which is like 150-some thousand in today's money. But they paid for all his expenses, all his film, all his darkroom chemicals, everything. It was a huge, especially for somebody who did as much work as he did. It was, so he gave all that up and quit life. He had a wife and 4 kids living in Croton-on-Hudson outside New York City, a really classic commuter suburb outside New York. And he gave up that income, and his mother died in February of 1955. So he quit life, and his mother died. And his mother, this is a long story, I can't really go into this, but his mother, who was Jim Kaplinger's aunt, she was his business manager, and she was a very domineering woman. She was a Catholic convert, very devout, and she was also a photographer. And her mother had been a photographer too. Jim said, I think out in Greensburg where they grew up, she was the first woman in town to have a camera. So it was in their blood. And Nettie was his mother's name. Very domineering, very strict, very authoritarian. And you can read the letters between them. They're at each other's throats all the time. But the truth is, he couldn't really he couldn't live without her. And the spiral, which became his death, a couple of decades later, I think really started when his ambitions started rising. He started comparing himself to Beethoven at about right around the moment. Not too long after that, his mother died, and he had Carmen, his wife, and his mother was living in their house with them in Croton-on-Hudson, and it just was becoming untenable. And his mother actually left the house a couple of years before she died, moved back here to Greensburg, and moved in with her mother. But when Nettie, his mother, left the house, that's when the spiral. When he started spiraling down at the same time that his ambitions were going up. And so she died in February of 55. In March of 55, he got a 3-week assignment. He had joined Magnum Photos, the prestigious cooperative, and he got a 3-week assignment to make 100 photographs of Pittsburgh for a book commemorating Pittsburgh's bicentennial. And the photographs were tightly scripted, 1 to 100. This is what we want you to shoot from this scene, and we expect you to have this done in 3 weeks. But he ended up making 22,000 photographs of Pittsburgh, and he attempted to create a photo essay to end all photo essays. This was going to be his masterpiece. It was going to be it was going to be something that showed people that he was a visionary and someone that had been held back by Life magazine. And this is where I entered the picture. My wife is from Pittsburgh, and I'm from rural coastal North Carolina, and Pittsburgh's about as different as it can get from my background. And the first time we went there to visit her family in 1994, I was just stunned by the city. It was just blew me away. I'd never seen anything like it, and still haven't. I still think it's one of the most unique places in the world. And in the New Yorker in the late 90s, Brendan Gill wrote that if Pittsburgh were located in the heart of Europe, people would travel thousands of miles to see it. But here, it's just not really thought of that way. But I think Smith saw something there that matched his ambitions. It was this revolving, what he called equilibriums of paradox. And in January of '97, I was working on my own book on Pittsburgh. Never heard of Smith's Pittsburgh pictures. And my wife gave me a camera for Christmas of '96. And I was in the camera shop in Raleigh, North Carolina. And I just wanted to make snapshots in Pittsburgh. I had no intention of becoming a photographer. I'm a writer. And I was just wanted snapshots to look at when I was back home working on this Pittsburgh book. And the guy in the camera shop said to me, "Have you ever seen Eugene Smith's Pittsburgh photographs?" And I said, "No, I haven't." And I said, "Well, tell me about it." And the night before, he had seen this American Masters PBS documentary on Smith called Photography Made Difficult. And it had made a big deal out of this unfinished Pittsburgh project. And I was enthralled. The project wasn't finished. It really collapsed under the weight of Smith's ambitions. He ended up making about 800 finished master prints from that set of 22,000. It was a mammoth accomplishment. He was trying to make 2,000 master prints. He made it about up to 800. And I believe it's one of the finest sets of photographs in American history. But he never really finished it. There's nothing you can do with 800 prints. You can't publish it. You can't exhibit it. It was doomed. There was no way he was going to finish it. And so my first project, which I started that day, I actually left the camera shop and went to the public library, and they had a biography of Smith by Jim Hughes, which I checked out. And that was the day that I began this work. And so my first book was this, as Patricia said, Dream Street. It was published by Norton in 2001. It was my attempt to pick up the pieces of his unfinished Pittsburgh project. And while I was working on that, in 1998, Smith's archive is at the University of Arizona, Tucson. And it's a long story of about how that ended up there. It had to do with Ansel Adams and some others who arranged to have him bequeath everything to the University of Arizona. And so I started working on this Pittsburgh project. The Carnegie Museum of Art I was working with them, curating an exhibition to go along with the book. And in the back of the photo archive in Arizona, there was a wall, maybe half the size of this big wall, with cardboard boxes stacked one on top of the other in rows. And I was in there one day, and usually you don't get to go into the back. You have to submit a form and using the finding aid, and they bring out what you want. But I had to go back there for some reason, and I saw this wall of cardboard boxes, and they were filled with these reels of tape. There were 1,740 reels of tape that Smith had made in that building that I showed you at the beginning. And I, was curious. And they were in the same boxes they had been put in when they arrived, and nobody had touched them since the late 70s. They weren't exactly a secret. This project, the Jazz Loft Project, some people make it seem like these tapes were discovered in a tomb in Egypt when they've written about it, but it wasn't quite true. And there were people that knew about it, but it was just daunting. What do you do with that many tapes? I mean, the first thing you have to do is restore them, and it took about $600,000 for us to do that, just to transfer the original reels. They had to be cleaned and then transferred to digital files. And so I started this, and I discovered these tapes in '98, and I started interviewing people. I picked through all 1,740 reels out there one day in '98, and I wrote down 138 names of jazz musicians that I recognized, chicken scratched in Smith's handwriting. And that's when what's called the Jazz Loft Project really started. And I'll tell you more about that. That's Smith in '57. This is the loft. This is the neighborhood. This is where the loft was, where he moved. This is the old wholesale flower district in New York City, back before. So the story is that when he moved into this loft in '57, he basically left his family behind in Croton. It's sad. And he gave up the big salary with Life magazine. He was poor. He was destitute. He was calling people like Jim to ask for money. And he moved into this building where there were a bunch of jazz musicians hanging out. And before he moved in, it was a jazz scene before he moved in. And so that's where it was. The geography, I'm not going to go into this, but the geography of that is really important. It's why a jazz scene would pop up and last as long as this one did. This one lasted about 11 years, and it was a commercial district. It was illegal to live there. It was illegal to reside in that neighborhood, which made it perfect for jazz because there was nobody around to complain late at night about loud noises. And it also made it was a downtrodden neighborhood, very central, and that was also why it was called the Flower District. And I mean, that's why the Flower District developed there, because it was central yet cheap. And so the flowers back before refrigeration, flowers were seasonal, purely seasonal. And now you can get anything you want any time of year. But back then, it had to be centrally located. They were wholesale dealers of flowers. They were dealing with hotels and restaurants usually. And so it was a central location. It was easy to distribute flowers there. And that's the same reason why this jazz scene lasted so long, was because it was easy to get to. The musicians could stop by from going from one place to another, or late at 3 in the morning. It was easy to stop by there. So I find that interesting. This is a picture of that building from the outside. The other thing about this, and the title of my talk, and it's the working title of my biography, is Picture Paradise. And Smith was really into gardens. His whole life, gardens, pop-up flowers, and he the picture, which I'm going to end up with in a few minutes, the Walk to Paradise Garden. But there are other examples too. And on these tapes, there's one tape where he goes on and on for minutes about this garden. When he went over to Spain to do the Spanish Village piece, he was driving from Paris down into Spain, and he came across a garden, which I'm trying to find. It's hard, but we can plot the course, and I'm gonna have to go over there and find it because it's too hard to find from this far away. But he goes on and on about this garden and what an impact it made on his life, and how it was carefully done. And he just knew that there was one person who was responsible for that garden. There was one person who just cared for that garden and loved it so much and made it great. And he just wondered who that one person was. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that he moved into the Flower District in New York. He left a bucolic large house in Croton-on-Hudson and moved into this squalor. I mean, this building had homemade plumbing, homemade electricity, and he lived there for the longest period of his life after he left Wichita. But I think something about the Flower District. These are a couple of his tapes. You can see the flower shop across the street. This is Zoot Sims in the loft. So this is a very different enterprise than what I was showing you before, where he was going out into the world and then coming back with something. And that was mainly what he did. Starting with Pittsburgh, he was really going at mainstream America. He was really photographing those readers of Life magazine. Usually, before that, he was going somewhere foreign to Life's readers, and then reporting back. And with Pittsburgh, it changed, and he started going after that readership. He was documenting that readership. And with Jazz Loft, which is by far the largest body of work of his career, there are 40,000 photographs, and there are 4,000 hours of tape. So that dwarfs anything else he did in his career. And this is really different. He wasn't going anywhere. He was just documenting right where he was. So what he was doing, this wasn't really a journalistic enterprise. And I find that very interesting. This is Vic Dickinson, Pee Wee Russell, and a drummer named Ronnie Bedford. Another tape. I wanted you to see this. So these tapes, sometimes they have, I think this is a fascinating, that's W. Eugene Smith, Both Good Sides, or Both Sides Good, December 59, January 60, jazz, one side starts. And then I love these markings here. But that is some information. At least we know when he thinks it is. He's not quite sure. He probably stacked up a pile of tapes this tall and then went back later and tried to figure out what each one was. And sometimes he got it wrong, we found. Sometimes the wrong reel is in the wrong box, so what's in the box has nothing to do with this. So it's been a lot of detective work. This is Patty Waters, a singer, Roland Kirk, Paul Bley. You can see the microphones hanging here. One of the questions is, what relation does this tape work have to his photography? And we can talk about that later. There's a lot of information here. January of '64. This is one of the examples where we can align a tape with his photography, because this session with Roland Kirk and Paul Bley is the same session as this tape. We were able to figure out. You can see Paul Bley's name there, and Roland, blonde Roland Kirk. There's Kirk. Here's Smith at the window. So he made 40,000 photographs in this building. About half of them are out of the window of the Flower District, life on the 6th Avenue, and the other half are the jazz scene. And take a note of that broken glass. This was also his dark room, so he had painted the glass black, and then it broke. And he liked that aperture, and I'll show you a couple of pictures that he shot through that broken window. Art Taylor, Freddie Red, bass player named Bill Takas. And this sort of is reminiscent of that photograph from World War II, where you have a subject in the foreground and then looking one direction, and the blurry subject in the background looking the other direction. He did this a lot with the musicians. Thelonious Monk, big part of this story. So this is really different enterprise. I mean, this kind of thing here is almost cubist. And it's a really different enterprise than that Life magazine journalism. Lots of abstract shots of musicians' hands. So her name is Rainie. She's the wife of guitarist Jimmy Rainie. Salvador Dali. Robert Frank, I interviewed Robert Frank, a photographer, about this project, um, um, and he said that Smith went from a public journalist to a private artist in this loft work. That was his phrase. There's Monk again, and you have that foreground background thing. Monk and Sam Jones. And also part of my saga here, which I think has allowed me to sustain all these years, is that I was able to go deep on a lot of these musicians and sort of get away from Smith for a little while. There are a lot of really fascinating people that he documented, and Thelonious Monk's one. Probably on my list of books after this is over will be a book about Monk. Hall Overton. Hall Overton was also involved in combat. He was a teacher at Juilliard. He was from rural apple farming, Michigan. He lived in the loft building. He had a home out in Queens. His wife was a singer in the Chordettes of Mr. Sandman fame. And he taught at Juilliard. His day job was teaching at Juilliard. And he went ashore at Normandy in World War II about 3 days after D-Day. And he carried stretchers in Belgium and France. And something about these two guys, were both involved in World War II, but not to fight. Smith was there to photograph it, and he was there to carry bodies. So I think something about that, and they seemed perfectly content even at home. And in fact, the Picture Paradise title, I think this loft was really the closest thing to home that Smith had after he left, and I think Overton felt the same way. Overton was also self-destructive. He died of cirrhosis of the liver at age 52. But he was another guy who was really revered by everyone. People loved him, and this loft, Juilliard did not allow jazz at the time. It was considered outlaw music, and Overton had created a name for himself as a jazz arranger and thinker, just a general thinker, and that was why Thelonious Monk was in the loft, and many others. If you had to name one person as to why this loft was a jazz scene, it would be this guy. And so if there's any sort of journalistic element to what Smith did in the loft, it's that he saved a lot of these figures from oblivion. Like the big icons like Monk and others who were in the loft, their legacy is completely polished without these loft tapes that Smith made. But a guy like Overton is completely resurrected because of what Smith did. We had an event at the New York Public Library about a month ago called Hall Overton Out of the Shadows. And Steve Reich, the minimalist, iconic composer, was there, and a couple others who were students of Overton, and just talking about what a force this guy was, but nobody knew it. It wasn't documented, and if Smith hadn't have done it, it wouldn't have happened. And then there are different things that he documented about the icons like Monk that are revelatory. Monk's band in 1959 in rehearsal in the loft. You can see this price tag is still on $2.88. In 1960, that's probably $12, $14 now in today's money, and Smith had 1,740 of these reels. So how do you afford that? I'm still not sure. I'm still trying to figure out exactly how I paid for that. This is an example of one of the people he documented for posterity that otherwise would have been lost, Ronnie Free, who lived in the loft for 2 years. And he was a severe heroin junkie, and he had stage fright. He couldn't hold down a gig. He was brilliant, but he couldn't hold down a gig because he had stage fright. And but in the loft there was no audience, so he was just fine. And he was the house drummer there for a couple of years. This is a guy named Jimmy Stephenson, who's a bass player from Detroit, and he another guy who was sort of saved, his legacy saved by Smith's tapes. Here's the window with the crack. I put this one in here because of Ansel Adams. Was a good friend of Smith's, and he was primarily the reason why his material ended up out at the University of Arizona. This is Dave Young, who was a painter in the loft, abstract expressionist painter. He was probably middle tier, but he loved jazz. And this is a piece of art that Dave made about Smith. These are cameras hanging around his neck, and Lamont Cranston was his nickname, Smith's nickname in the loft, because of his shadowy way of maneuvering. Of course, Lamont Cranston, the alter ego of Lamont Cranston was the Shadow, the serial character. This is a picture of the building, and those are silhouette cutouts at the top. This photograph was a step towards this, which was his attempt. And you know, the paradise angle, I mean, I think that this may have been as close as he came. This is the cover of my book, and I'm gonna just to sort of complete the story. This is Japan, so he went on. Most of the 60s he was doing this loft work, and most people, the way he gets written about is that the 60s were a waste. He was in squalor and down and out, and nobody wanted to hire him because they feared it would trigger another Pittsburgh Odyssey. And but he finally got a couple things happened in '69, late '60s. He got a Guggenheim grant. He had Aperture did a monograph. He sort of got back on the scene. There was a huge retrospective of his career at the Jewish Museum in '71, and then he and his second wife Eileen went to Japan and documented Minamata. This picture, I think, is the machinery and then the solitary sort of noble individual up against the giant machinery. That's another example of that. And Minamata was an example of that at large, because it was he and Eileen documented the mercury pollution, the corporate mercury pollution in that village. I'll just show a couple of pictures from that, and then I'm going to finish up, take questions. So as part of this biography, I'm going to try to walk in his footsteps in as many of these places as I can. And his second wife, Eileen, is going to go with me to Minamata. You've probably seen this. But again, the caregiving theme is ever present. So I'm going to finish with this. I'm going to read a couple of pages from the end of my Jazz Loft Project book, and it concerns this photograph, which is hanging in the show. And there's a beautiful piece written about this photograph in the book that goes with the show by Tony Nelson. Yeah, beautiful piece. In fact, I probably could have just stood up here and read her piece, and it would have been the best thing I could do. On one of Smith's tapes from 1962, you can hear a neighborhood beat cop wander into the loft, and Smith, clearly familiar with the officer, says proudly, "You know, my son Pat got married last weekend." Pat, now 67 and a retired race car mechanic, and his sister Juanita are the protagonists of Smith's photograph, The Walk to Paradise Garden, on the screen, which was made in 1946 when they were 2 and 4 years old. The photograph was chosen by Edward Steichen to close his famous 1955 show, Family of Man, at the Museum of Modern Art. In one of Smith's unlabeled loft tapes, there is a surreal 28-minute monologue in which Smith breathlessly describes his efforts to maneuver his wife, mother, and oldest daughter out of the house so he could set up his two younger children for the picture in the yard outside. And I'm quoting Smith. We found this on the tapes, him reading this. Quote, "I kept only the younger children with me, for I believed they would comprehend least the drama that was taking place within me. How strange, how contradictory, here in the quiet of my home, with two of my beloved children peacefully playing in an adjoining room, with music the one and only intruding sound. How strange that in this kindly setting I could be living an emotional and physical crisis, more personally terrifying in its potency than any I had ever previously encountered in a life far from tranquil. And this hinged on the mere making of a photograph." Shortly after, unquote, shortly after Pat's wedding to his high school sweetheart, Phyllis, Smith began calling his son and daughter-in-law in the middle of the night, telling them goodbye, saying he was committing suicide. After each call, Pat and Phyllis would race down to the Flower District loft. Finally, Pat flatly told his father he wouldn't be responding to any more suicide calls. In 2007, Pat called me and told me he was cleaning out the basement of his Pleasant Valley, New York home. Did I want some of his father's equipment, he asked. I bought Smith's custom-made 8-foot stainless steel loft darkroom sink. I also bought a custom-made wood light table, two of Smith's old large format Sinar cameras and lenses, and the high-powered long lens that Smith used to make telephoto images from his loft window. I promised Pat that I'd sell it all back to him at the same price if he ever wanted it, or if I wanted to get rid of it. The cameras and lenses are in first-rate condition. The first exposure I made with the old 4x5 Sinar, with the help of my friend Frank Hunter, was of the railroad tracks in the Around the Y neighborhood in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, about 200 yards from Thelonious Monk's childhood home, which is about 60 miles from the small town in the coastal plains of North Carolina where I was born and raised. That seemed appropriate, but I don't know what I'm going to do with Smith's sink. Not infrequently, I wonder if I should be doing something else, doing my own work from scratch rather than picking up the pieces of Smith's failed, unfinished opuses. In 2003, I was having lunch with Smith's longtime girlfriend and loft mate, Carol Thomas, in a diner in Santa Monica, California. And I told her that I found it uncanny how Smith always found people to assist him. And I've come across this scenario many times. He had this way of luring people, and people liked him. People wanted to be around him. He had this way of luring people into his life, men and women, but mostly women, and they would help at the moment when he needed help the most. They would help him get up on his feet, generate some income at just the most perilous time. And Carol was one of them, and one of the best. She was really smart and came from a theater background, and so I said to Carol, I told her how I found it uncanny how Smith always found people to assist him, to help him do what he himself couldn't do, just at the right moment. She looked at me dead in the eye and said, "He's still doing it." And I recovered from Carol's comment, but it left a mark. I feel that Smith left melodramatic breadcrumbs like the monologue of the making of the Walk to Paradise Garden for a gullible researcher to follow. But his melodrama sells him short. In 2004, when the founding director of Magnum Photo and Smith's original estate executive, John Morris, visited me at the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke, I asked him why so many people put up with Smith's pathologies. John paused for several seconds and simply said, "Gene was worthwhile." In 2008, in an interview with me and WNYC Radio's Sarah Fishko, Smith's friend, the legendary photographer Robert Frank, said, quote, "Gene was different. He was absolutely different from anybody else. When he looked at you, when he opened his mouth, there was that passion. That's how he made his mark. It's almost naive today to be like that, to think like that. And I think today people don't have that passion that he had, that most extraordinary quality and that passion and the belief in it. In the last 13 years, I've met more than 350 people along the way. Some are famous, but most are unrecorded in the official annals of music, photography, or anything else. The experience has been the wonder and fortune and redemption of this work. On January 11, 2006, my colleague Dan Partridge and I were in a 400 square foot room on the 9th floor of an old apartment building on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, interviewing a youthful 80-year-old trumpet player who had lived in that room for 35 years. Among stacks of prostitute catalogs and layers of accumulated New York City apartment grit, the trumpeter had an upright piano, and on top of it was a list of New Year's resolutions. Number one was get more gigs. When we emerged from the interview, night had fallen, and it was raining hard. As I darted down the wet subway stairs carrying digital audio equipment, my left foot slipped, snapping 2 bones in my ankle. I spent overnight on a gurney in the emergency room at St. Vincent's Hospital. Next to me was an elderly African-American lady who had been hit by a taxi, and like me, she was filled with painkillers. These injuries, she kept telling me overnight, will keep us from doing things that would have hurt us worse. And that's it. So I'd be happy to take some questions. Yeah.
Yes, I have a quick question. My name is James Mitchell. How did the late W. Eugene Smith with Life magazine for good? Can you tell me?
How?
Yeah.
Well, one of the interesting, he resigned. He submitted a letter of resignation in late 1954, and it was effective like January 10th of 55. So he wasn't paid as a staff photographer. He didn't have a salary anymore. But they still, it wasn't like they completely severed ties. He would propose things to them. They would still entertain his proposals. And they did publish his Minamata series in the 70s. But he wasn't on the payroll anymore. So he just resigned. He just quit. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Well, his jaw was basically maimed. He also had some injuries to his hand, to his arm. But the main problem was the whole lower part of his face was severely damaged, and for the rest of his life he had trouble chewing. And people who knew him have told me that he had kind of a lisp after that. But I think he was knocked unconscious, but the thing that took a year or so to rehabilitate was his jaw and his whole mouth, and like the whole cavity, I think, was really just a mess. I think it's the kind of thing that would be easy. I think people who have like motorcycle accidents or something. I've got a friend who's an ENT surgeon, and he said, he sees people from car wrecks and motorcycle wrecks where like their whole face is basically deformed and gone. Everything's shattered. But now they can fix that better than they could then, and that's my understanding. Jim, does that fit your memory of what happened? The injury from World War II, from the bomb in Okinawa. Yeah. Yeah. And he one of the theories about, he developed this very severe amphetamine addiction. And one of the theories about that is that it grew out of the pain medication he had to take for a year or more after World War II. And he drank a lot. He drank a fifth of liquor every day. And I think he was medicating himself. Yeah. That's a really great question. Especially that taping enterprise was so expensive, and it was not just the tapes, but the equipment, the recorders and the microphones. He was always upgrading it. But he was capable of generating income when he needed it. And like I said earlier, he had this way of luring people in who could help him. Like, for example, one guy was an attorney for Motown. His name was George Schiffer, and he was Barry Gordy's attorney. And he wandered into the loft because of the musicians one time, and he saw the world famous, iconic Eugene Smith living in complete squalor in the loft. And he was like, "What the hell? I can help this guy. I know how to manage artists. I'll get him back up on his feet." And he did, and he generated some income for him. He sold some prints for advertisements. He was capable of, Ford Motor Company, people like that would sometimes use some of his pictures. Jack Daniels hired him. But then Schiffer told me that he generated him some money, got him back up on his feet, and got all of his bills paid. And then Smith comes back in with a whole armload of new tape recording equipment. So he just was constantly broke. If he had money, he would spend it right away. But so I think he cobbled it together. He also got loans from all kinds of people. He wasn't afraid to call friends and say, "I need $1,000. Can you please help me?" Yeah, I think he had his hand up first. But yeah, they're it's like 1,300 rolls of film. So it was in the loft. It was exclusively 35. Yeah, and he would use the large format in some of his assignments, but in the loft, that was impossible because he had to move around. You might be asking, it was so dark in there. It was the middle of the night. So how did he with such little light? How did he do that? And he had this. He created this tripod, but it wasn't really a tripod. It was just like one. It was like a one pod or a unipod, and that's how he was able to keep the camera still enough to make those pictures with such low light in the middle of the night. Yeah, he was hired by a guy named Stefan Laurent, who was hired by the civic leaders in Pittsburgh to create a book commemorating the city's bicentennial. And he had joined Magnum after he quit life. He joined Magnum, and that was going to be how he ran his career from then on, through Magnum. And he was friends with Cartier-Bresson and Kappa, and so they lured him into there. And that seemed like it was going to go well. But that Pittsburgh Odyssey, they kept fronting him money for that. And he won 2 successive Guggenheim grants, one of the few people to ever do that for the Pittsburgh project. But he quit life. He quit Magnum. He realized he was breaking them and was hurting them. So it was a combination of Magnum and the book, Stefan Laurent, who was hired to create a book about Pittsburgh. Yeah. I don't know. That's still. I think if Thelonious Monk is playing piano, you can understand the impulse to press. No, no. But the things that are baffling are there are some tapes where you can hear the door open on 6th Avenue, and then you can hear somebody walk up 5 flights of steps. He had the whole stairwell mic'd. So what is that? That becomes a little bit. Amphetamine addicts were known to be paranoid, apparently, and so there's a level of surveillance that hits. But I need to do a lot more thinking about this. But I think that on some level, it's the same thing he was doing with his photography. When he would go live with these subjects for months and make thousands of photographs around the clock, I think in some ways he just decided. The thing is if you go back to the 50s and if you look at magazines from that day, especially men's magazines, there are ads for portable tape recorders everywhere, and it was a real fad. It was new. It used to be if you want to record something, you had to have a machine, the size of this whole desk. And so the suitcase-sized recorder was brand new in the 50s. And Smith always loved technology, and he always mastered technology in his own idiosyncratic ways. One of the things we learned on the tapes, the reputation for these tapes was poor because the photo world, of which back in the 50s was about 15 people, the photo world had deemed him to have lost his mind once and for all when he started making these tapes. He wasn't using his resources for his gift, which was photography. And he had quit life, and who would do that? So the tapes didn't have a good reputation, and when the project began, I had to overcome that in terms of fundraising, because people would, make a call to their favorite photo expert in New York, and the person would say, "Oh, these tapes are trash. It's just a bunch of cats meowing," and there's a lot of cats meowing on the tapes, but so we really had to overcome the reputation of these tapes. And one of the things that we found when we finally heard them was that they sound great. He had applied the same level of mastery of technique to these tapes. I mean, not all of them sound great because he didn't know sometimes the jam session would set up over here and he had all his mics over here. He couldn't get it, and they're not all great. But the degree to which they're even good is remarkable. And that was a real surprise. We didn't know what we were going to get. That was a big obstacle for fundraising. When you do I'm sure a lot of you have written these grant proposals, but you have to tell the funder exactly what you're going to do like 3 years from now. We had no idea because nobody had ever heard the tapes, and we didn't know how much volume there was or anything. So we're still listening. My colleague Dan goes to work every day and puts on headphones, and he's been doing that for 7 years, and he still has about 900 CDs. There are 5,089 CDs, and he sort of filters them, and he does a spreadsheet on what the content is, and I look at it and decide if I'm going to listen to it or not. But he's endured. I should have him here. I mean, he's got to listen to cats meowing. He's got to listen to people walking up and down the stairs. He's got to listen to, there's one tape that's 8 hours, and it seems to be the only thing on the tape is Smith and Jimmy Stephenson, who lived in the loft, are preparing the building for building inspectors. So it was illegal to live there, so they were hammering and sawing and putting up walls and trying to hide the fact that they were living there. And they did that for like 8 hours one day, and that's what's on a tape. And there's a transistor in the corner tuned to WBAI radio, and so there's some music and all kinds of interesting talk programs, and we can barely make that out. And there's a lot of stuff off radio and TV that's recorded well, and that stuff is fascinating. I think I was quoted in this magazine called Chamber Music, which is a real high-end music magazine by the Chamber Music Society of America, and the guy quoted me, and I don't know if I said this, but I probably did. He said, I said, we don't even care if the music's any good. We almost skip over the music because we're more interested in the things that he recorded. Yeah, the conversations and the things he recorded off radio and TV. But I don't think I feel quite that strongly about that. But I might have been trying to make that point because it's called the Jazz Loft Project, and it's true the jazz is really the cornerstone of the project. But the other stuff is we just don't want to rule that out. It's fascinating. And there's a lot of things recorded off radio and TV that were live that weren't recorded. So it was just a live broadcast like Met Opera performances. And but also talk programs. There's a program with Tennessee Williams and Yukio Mishima, the Japanese writer. There's a program with them two talking. And it's incredible. And we don't know that that particular program was recorded, but Smith got it. Yeah, you've been raising your hand for.
Sam, I was really intrigued by the email that you sent me about your journeys for over the next year and a half, 2 years. Would you talk a little bit about following in Smith's footsteps, the places that you're planning to go?
Yeah, next. Yeah, as part of this biography, I feel it's important to go see these places. I need to go see Japan especially. His second wife, Eileen, who was Japanese American, she said that he always felt like he was from Japan in a former, or from the Pacific in a former life, that he really felt an affinity there. And he was there 3 major times. World War II, Hitachi in the early 60s. That's another answer to the question of where he got money. The company Hitachi paid him a lot of money to go photograph over there. And then Minamata being the trilogy, the Japan trilogy. And so in October 25th, I'm gonna go to the Pacific for a couple of weeks and go to these sites. I'm gonna try to go to the World War II sites, and I'm gonna go to Minamata and Hitachi. And then next March, I'm gonna go to I believe, I can't remember the order here, but what I'm doing is I'm going to these places at the same time of year that he was, so I can see the same light that he saw. I can't see the same scenes, but I can see roughly the same sunlight. And I think that's important. And so in like 2 successive months next spring, I can't remember the order, I'm going to Gabon, Africa to see the Schweitzer compound medical facility. And then I'm going to go to Spain and see De La Tosa, who the village that he photographed there. And I'm going to go to Wales, where he made some wonderful photographs of the coal mining culture on the way to Spain. And so yeah, that's what there are also domestic places. I've been to Pittsburgh many, many times, walked in his footsteps there. Nurse midwife in rural South Carolina, I'll go there, and I'll go to Colorado, where he did Country Doctor. And I just feel like I sent out this email, which Amy is referring to something like, I don't know how many friends, but I sent it out to a lot of people, and a couple of really good friends, including a very successful biographer, way more successful than me, but he does literary biographies. He said I was crazy. He said, you're crazy. You're not going to, this is a waste of money and time. You can't go to all these places. It's not practical, and you're not going to learn anything anyway. But I think with this medium, the Smith, which was all light, you have to see what he was dealing with. And so I don't, and plus I just don't know if anybody knows of any. Let me know. But how come there aren't more photographer biographies? I mean, there's the Arbus one by Bosworth, and James Mello wrote the Walker Evans, but he didn't finish it. He died before he finished it, which might be something I should probably, respond to. But if anybody knows, and I think part of the reason, I mean, if you're a literary biographer, you don't have to leave the house. You just read the books, and you just live in the person's head, But when your job is to be out somewhere, like Smith was so often, I mean, he wasn't at home. Even before his family broke up, he was never at home. I mean, he was in the Pacific for 3 years photographing World War II. These life assignments would take months. So if that's what he did, I feel like I've got to go see these places. And if anybody has any ideas on how to fund these trips, let me know. Yeah. The building today is owned by a Chinese family that imports and sells wigs. And they own a couple of buildings right along there. And I've been in there many times. He moved out, he was evicted. And there's a lot of paperwork about that, where he was threatened with eviction. But he also went to Japan.